So for everybody who doesn't know me, I'm Lisa Wood. I'm the Northwest Manager for the PRCA here in Manchester. I work a day a week for the PRCA and I have another job for a tech company. And our chair, Nigel, is on one of the little screens. You probably see him joining us today as well.
Hello, folks.
Hello,
Emma. Nice to see you.
So for those who don't know a great deal about
Charlie, hello, Charlie. Hello, Vicky.
Hi.
We run lots of different events. Normally, we've been going back to face-to-face, but obviously due to the strikes, we've gone online today, sadly. But hopefully we can maybe pick up something around this topic later on in the summer, back out somewhere hopefully in Manchester. Just a bit of housekeeping. It's probably best if when we kick off, those who aren't on the panel just put their screens, well, you can leave your screen on if you want, but I sometimes switch mine off and obviously put everything onto silent. So as I mentioned before, we're just recording this and it will go onto the PRCA social media sites, YouTube, etc., and things like that. Also, just wanted to say we are looking for new people to join our committee at the minute. So we've had a bit of a reshuffle. Some people have left, and so if anyone's interested, give me a shout. I can let you know a little bit more about what that's involved and different things that people get involved in. So yeah, I'm going to hand you over to Charlie Brooks. Well, you're not at Man United anymore, are you now, Charlie?
We've just finished at Manchester United. Hence my relaxed demeanour.
Yes, I was asking about his new job, but he can't tell us anything yet. But Charlie was the former director of communications. That's the correct title, isn't it? At Manchester United. And at Nike as well, and he's going to be chairing the session over the next hour. So if you've got any questions as well, if you want to pop them onto the chat, we can ask them at the end or throughout the session. So I will leave it to Charlie to kind of kick off and introduce the rest of the panel, who thank you for joining us today.
No problem. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks. I've joined a few of the PRCA events, always enjoyed them. So it was a pleasure to be asked to host this, which is fairly wide-ranging brief. Women, over half the population of the planet, the media, probably the biggest thing on the planet, and sport, the second biggest thing on the planet. So we kept it wide, and we'll try and narrow it down a little bit as we go on. But delighted to host this with some very esteemed panelists. So I'll just introduce each in turn. So Alice McKeegan is head of football at the MEN Reach Group, and one of the only female editors, if not the only senior female editor in the country. So welcome, Alice. Claire Butters is the head of sales and partnerships at Sales Sharks, so one of our sort of foremost sporting organisations in the Northwest. And Vicky Owens is moving to a new job at Channel 4, but for the last few years has been head of communications for sport, children's and entertainment, I think it is, at BBC. So three people who come from very different sort of takes on women's sport and the media. We're also due to have Laura Weston here, who's a member of the Women's Sport Trust and advisor to the Women's Sport Trust. And hopefully she can join, because I know the Women's Sport Trust has done a lot of work recently and a lot of research that would be useful for the conversation. I just wanted to sort of start by setting the scene. I was doing a bit of research for this, and there was an academic study I came across from the US from 2019 that had studied media coverage for the last 30 years in sport, and fairly shocking statistics about the level of coverage of women's sport in the media. And apparently 80% of all sports highlights and sports magazine shows in the US over the last 30 years featured no women's content at all. So, clearly the background to this is a history of extreme inequality and very poor coverage. We're seeing a sea change at the moment in the UK, and I think in other countries as well. And that's led by a lot of different organizations, whether that's sports bodies, the media, and we're seeing a sort of huge shift in that. And I think I'd like to start, Vicky, the BBC really probably is the most, the national broadcaster really exemplifies that change a little bit, because what we've seen from the corporation in terms of the scale of coverage, in terms of the number of female presenters and on-air talent is really sort of accelerated over the last few years. So could you just talk a little bit about the BBC and how that has worked for you in terms of women's sport coverage?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I think women's sport is hugely important to us. And I think we have a huge benefit in that we have a director of sport who's a woman, used to be a gymnast, so women's sport is really important to her. And I think she's pushed things, she's really driven things. And I think a pivotal moment for us, you talk about that research from 2019. In 2019, we ran a campaign called Change the Game. which was all about women's sport. And basically we took a moment in time that year we had a women's football World Cup and a women's netball World Cup. And then obviously you have things like athletics and Wimbledon where you've got mixed events. So we took that moment in time to try and really make a difference and really shout about women's sport. And what was incredible was we got buy-in from across the whole corporation. So it was editorial, it was comms, it was marketing, it was social. And when you leverage everything the BBC has got, we all know what impact that can have. And, when we looked at viewing figures from sort of previous tournaments to that year, it made a massive, massive difference. So for us, that was definitely sort of a line in the sand moment where, because what we want to get to the point is where sport is just sport. So, for us, that was a real moment where women's sport was drawing in the same kind of audiences that we would expect for men's sport, and historically that hadn't necessarily been the case.
Alice, we talked in the build up to this a little bit, and we've got Women's Euros coming up. We've got 3 venues in the Manchester area, so hugely exciting for the region. Do you want to talk a little about what the Euros are going to mean to you as a sort of tipping point moment for women's football here? Obviously, WSL has done a great game, and now this has a chance to really accelerate it further.
Yeah, the Euros are huge for Manchester and obviously the whole country. In terms of the MEN, we're part of the wider Reach company. So we've seconded a reporter to the role of women's football editor for the duration of the tournament, which is a massive step. We've never done that before. So he'll be responsible for bringing together all of our content from reporters out in the field at the games, pulling that together. So we'll be doing things like covering the games live, so live blogs, exactly the same as we do for the men's game. So they are investing a lot of time and resources and energy into covering the Euros, which is fantastic. And to be fair, the last couple of tournaments we've gone big on them, but this just feels, because it's a home tournament, like it's a really a chance to do something even more and slightly different. So from our perspective, at the MEN, we'll be sending a reporter to all of the local games, covering them live, doing events in the build-up, press conferences, etc. So it's going to be huge, and hopefully there'll be a huge audience for it that we haven't seen before. But I think it's also about being realistic and thinking about the games in a different way as well. So thinking, can you do things on social media perhaps in a different way to engage a new audience, and perhaps people that haven't seen the women's game as much? So can you use Instagram, do live Instagram stories or Q&As with, say, a female pundit or a player? And it's just thinking outside the box, really, and ways that you can get new eyes on the sport.
Claire, so obviously in your role at Sale Sharks, you're responsible for developing an audience for the men's side, but you have the women's team as well, and the women's team is still amateur. So the men's team fully professional, the women's team is still amateur. How do you approach that to that point, sort of thinking outside the box or bringing a new audience in, whether it's a new female audience for the men's team or whether it's a new audience for your women's team as well? How do you approach that from a marketing point of view?
It's a huge challenge, if I'm honest. I think rugby probably sits where football was maybe 10-15 years ago, right? So especially women's rugby. Our team's 2 years, 2020 was when our women's team was formed, and it's difficult because they're semi-professional, right? So they don't have the same accessibility. They've got amazing stories to tell, but not necessarily the time and access to tell them, if that makes sense. I think how we plan to use the women's team is to use them as role models for girls. So we talk internally about, if you can see it, you can be it. So if we can use these girls for younger girls and break down those barriers to entering rugby, that's kind of one focus for us. And then at the moment, we're having a huge debate about our logo, and should we have a Sale Sharks women's logo, or should it just be Sale Sharks and we have a men's and women's team? And I'm firmly in the latter. I don't think we should have it separated. I think Vicky said before, sport's sport, whether you're male or female, I don't necessarily think it should be categorized separately. But I think, there's huge ambition in the club to try and put women's sport on the same levels as men's, but it's always going to sit a bit behind until it becomes fully professional, because you can't, it doesn't bring in the revenue that a men's game and the TV rights around men's rugby brings. So I think we're going to use that more in a grassroots way and more around role models and storytelling for younger girls, and that they can come into rugby and that it's not for guys and that they shouldn't feel like it's not a sport for them. And probably quite like boxing or cricket, I guess, in that kind of world.
I think that's an interesting point in terms of that there's a bit of an elephant in the room when talking about the development of the women's game and of the media coverage, that at the moment, with a few exceptions in tennis and other areas, the women's game doesn't bring in the same revenue or the same viewership. So, you know, the BBC, for example, as a public service broadcaster, has been able to drive that without seeing a commercial return. Alice, clearly your editorial coverage is not driven by commercial returns, but it is a factor, isn't it, in terms of the resource you can realistically apply to it versus the viewership or the clicks or the reads it's going to bring in.
Yeah, absolutely. The majority of media companies are businesses, so we have to do things to cater for our audience, for what the audience wants, and that traditionally has been men's Premier League football, not even, you know, the lower league teams. I'm just talking about United and City from an MEM perspective. However, I do think things are changing, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, really. If you don't change as a media publisher, you don't know what the audience wants. You might be looking at readership numbers from 5 years ago, and women's sport in general has got a lot more popular since then, and there are more, you know, for example, on the BBC, more female pundits, even on Sky Talk Sport. A lot is being done to change the game and change people's perceptions. So if you're judging online audience readership from, say, 5 years ago, that may not be the case now if you do something. So it's about trying new things. And I also think that it is obviously a challenge, but I don't think we have enough women within the media, print media. I'm talking about print and digital media. You know, I still sometimes feel, in the nicest possible way, a little bit like an alien. Now, Reach have done a lot to try and encourage more women into the industry. I've set up a peer mentor group for younger reporters, more junior editors, so that they feel like they can rely and lean on perhaps people with a little bit more experience ahead of them. However, it can still be an off-putting world for female journalists, and if you have an industry where it's all just men. I'm not saying everyone's, I'm not stereotyping here, but they probably are less likely to try covering women's sport generally as a rule, which means that we don't know what the audience wants if you've never tried it before. So I think events like the Euros, having some of the games in England, in Manchester, for example, hopefully we'll see that the crowds will be good, because obviously we're back in a non-pandemic world. And then in turn, media companies are more willing to try things, and then we'll see this summer that there is a growing audience for it, and it's the right thing to do as well. As you say, half the population are female. We shouldn't be excluding them and not giving them the opportunity to get involved, participate in sport, and also watch women's sport as well.
I talked about, it's a shame Laura isn't here, because the Women's Sport Trust did some research, and one of the statistics they found was that 5.9 million new viewers to the Women's Super League had not watched women's sport in 2021 prior to that current season. So, to your point, what the BBC and Sky have done, with credit to both of them in terms of the scale of coverage, the level of coverage, the level of promotion and exposure, drives a new audience that isn't an established women's sport audience. Vicky, have you seen that shift internally as well, in terms of as success breeds success within the organisation? Does it start to feel like it's a rolling snowball inside as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as much as we're not commercially driven, but we do have to offer value for money for licence fee payers. So if we're going to pay a rights fee for an event, it's got to be something our audience want to watch. And I think Alice said, it is chicken and egg. So it's got to be good. When you point cameras at it, it's got to look good. The product has got to be good. So, and I think sports bodies now get that. And, like what football, women's football is probably the best example. We will see sell-out stadiums across the UK. That looks great on TV. So then more commercial partners want to get involved, and then the game grows and prospers. And I think lots of other sports are trying to sort of replicate that model. Netball in particular is doing really, really well. We saw when the World Cup was here. So absolutely. And it's not within the business, it's not a hard sell. So talking about the Women's Euros, we're broadcasting every game for the tournament. And we had our launch for it last week. and every bit of the BBC wants to cover it. So we had Radio 1 there, you know, you've got Radio 2, BBC news outlets, all the radio networks, the One Show want to do stuff. That 5-10 years ago would have been a really hard sell of sort of trying to get them. But the names that, you know, people recognise the names of footballers, that kind of stuff. So absolutely, once something sort of starts to snowball, it's a much easier pitch and much easier to get sort of people buying. And external media as well. We had 70-80 press at our Euros launch last week, and again, to Alice's point, it's about going to where the audience are. A lot of the audience are more female, younger, so it's about sort of print media is still massively important to us, but so are content creators, influencers, working with brands. It's getting to where your audience are and understanding that it is a different audience to male football and sort of adjusting to that. It's not a one size fits all.
Alice, we talked a little bit in our sort of pre-conversation about this, and the pitching you're getting from PRs around whether it's women's football or women's sport in general, other sports. You know, what's the reality of that? Do you feel like you're getting PRs giving you the service you need, or is there more that PRs should be taking and a different approach they should be taking on women's sport?
It's as Vicky says, it can't be one size fits all. So at the minute, I find from personal perspective that a lot of the emails that I get from PR agencies and PRs, it's as if they're just doing the same as they do for a men's football campaign. So we might just get a press release after the PR company have had time with the athlete, for example. So it's just some quotes, very beige, very bland, not really the type of thing we do. I mean, to be honest, we'd be unlikely to use that for a men's football. But say, for example, if it's Cristiano Ronaldo or Paul Pogba, there is always an online audience and readership for that. So if it's a quirky video, you might put that out. But it's just, if they thought about it perhaps from a different perspective and tried to treat things differently, say, for example, they had an hour with a women's footballer, if they invited media to the hour and we could do, say, a live Instagram Q&A or get some video, that would have a much bigger reach. Would cover it, but also it would go further. We could put that on our Twitter, on our Facebook channels, on Instagram. And again, you're going to, you know, attract new audience to it and perhaps reach the people that if we just put an article up with some bland quotes, you know, 500 people might read that. Whereas if you put a video out on our Facebook page to 6 million audience, you might get, you know, a reach of 500,000. So it's about just thinking slightly differently. And I'd much rather, I always say, I'd much rather be involved in the conversation earlier rather than just it coming in pre-ready, because that doesn't work for us. It doesn't really work for anyone. I'd much rather get an email in the early planning stages saying, we're doing this, what would work for you? And maybe it's a conversation about, you know, what access we could get.
That's an interesting point. When I was at United, sometimes access with the women's team was easier than the men's team, frankly. And you know, I've heard that from other PRs at clubs as well. But when in your case, you've got a situation where, because the women are still not professional, they're training a finite amount of time. You haven't got them all day at the training ground that you can then leverage media time on the back of it. They've got fixed evening training. So actually access is not quite as easy in your case. Is that correct?
Yeah, for our women's, it's really tough. And I think I agree with what Alice said. Like, there's certain types of content and certain tone of voice that works better on our women's channels than our men's channels, and we're really aware of that. But then for us to be able to give press an hour with our women's team would be a monumental organisation plan, because they'd need to take time off work, they'd need to get childcare, they'd need to be available in the day down at Carrington all at the same time. And a lot of these girls, you know, we've got teachers in the team, vets in the team. It's not so easy just to take a half-day holiday. So it becomes logistically quite challenging. And then from a media perspective, media don't necessarily want to come to the training ground at 8 o'clock at night, because that's the time all the girls are there. So our challenge is more around building the profile on the women's channels that we've got, and almost dovetailing off the back of the men's stories to add in the women's. And that's, you know, even with men's rugby, I don't think there's been a dedicated men's rugby journalist for Union in the region historically. Alice might correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that's the case. So you from a men's point of view, you're getting league journalists or general sports journalists covering Union, and then you're trying to really grow the women's game and get traction with those stories, which arguably are richer stories because they're more interesting, because they do have a regular life, and how do they fit everything in? So yeah, our challenge is probably slightly different in that how do we create those moments for access to the girls that are in the team, and some of them are internationals. So there is some really interesting storytelling to do, but it's more the logistics of how do we make that happen. And we do it a lot like this, to be honest. We'll get interviews with media will be done on Zoom from their homes, and they'll be briefed ahead of that. But it's not quite the same as face to face or putting an event on and giving Insta stories, takeovers, or Q&As and all that kind of stuff. So it's in the plans and it's part of our plan. But I think, Charlie, you said it before, when you've got quite a small commercial team to deliver across two teams, and you've got revenue targets and all the rest of it that comes with working in a club, it's hard to really elevate. You've got to make a conscious effort to almost overinvest in the women's to make sure that pulls up. Otherwise, you never, I think the girl said before, you're never going to change it. It's chicken and egg, because if we don't overinvest in our women's team, how will they grow? But then you've got that balance of we've got to give the men's team enough time and energy and media contact to pull in those sponsorships and pull in that revenue to the club, while not forgetting our women. So yeah, it's tough. It's really tough.
One thing I was really aware of when dealing with the women's team at United was they really felt their responsibility, not just to the club, but to the game itself, to grow the game. That was something that they lived and breathed all the time. And do you find that with your players as well? And presumably some of them must be looking to professionalism and saying, right, if we can take that next step, we have a much bigger opportunity and then more media opportunities as well.
Yeah, and I think about, so we've got Lauren Delaney has moved over from Ireland. A lot of the girls in Ireland come to England to play rugby because it's not so big in Ireland, which is insane when you look at men's rugby over there. They get frustrated that the league, it's the best league in the world for women's rugby, but they get frustrated that they don't have the opportunity to go pro, like it isn't an option for them. So they're at the top of their game in a semi-professional league. So their frustrations come more from being able to train every day like the men's and get better and have that time, rather than it being, a Tuesday and a Thursday night, 3 hours training sessions and then gym work in their own time. So I think, for women, it becomes, they want the opportunity to become professional, and it isn't, that next step isn't there at the moment for them to do that. So I think for women's rugby, it's going the same way as women's football, like getting that professional league, and that so they can become focused. That is their full-time role, and then I think we'd see the standard of women's rugby improve as well.
Vicky, you talked earlier on about the level of exposure around the Euros and the press launch you did, and so you must find with the presenters you've got now, the opportunity to use them as evangelists for the BBC, but for the women's game as well, is huge as well. Is that something you've really focused on through the work you do?
Yeah, we are very blessed that we have some incredible female presenters, from Gabby Logan to Subat. We have got lots of them and they are incredible. And they work across sports as well. So, you look at Gabby, and Gabby can do everything from football to athletics to rugby, and she's an absolute professional. So again, with our presenters, we try not to sort of do the whole, she's a brilliant presenter. So, she can present football as well as Gary Lineker can present football. So, and then we're always looking at the next level coming through. So now you've got Isha Guha, Alex Scott. We've got a really good pipeline of strong female presenters as well. So when you look to the future, we've got, they're up there with your Jermaine Genuses in terms of sort of the next level and the new generation.
Okay, Alice, in terms of the coverage that you're able to give to it, you talked about the Euros is going to be a big moment, and you've got very successful women's teams in the areas in football. You've got the rugby and Sale Sharks. Is it something that you think you'll be able to give more coverage to in future? Is it something you'll be able to accelerate across Reach Group? And is there a discussion between media organisations? It felt to me that there was a real surge in media coverage across many different media at the same time, almost as if it was something that people had got together to discuss separately, or is it all very internalized and it's just everybody's seeing the same phenomenon at the same time?
Yeah, it's a difficult one again. Some of the problem that we have in terms of staffing the women's games is that they're often on the same days as the men's Premier League fixtures, and it does create a real dilemma for us because we only have a relatively small team. We don't have a dedicated women's reporter, and we have to decide, are we going to send to Old Trafford for the men's team, or are we going to send to Lee Sports Village to cover the women's team? And because for example, at Man United, Lee Sports Village is quite out of the way. We have to send our men's reporters to the ground, say 3 hours before. They can't physically go to Lee, cover the game, then sit in traffic and be at Old Trafford 3 hours before if the games are on the same day. So it is a real challenge. The same thing happens with City games as well. It's not just a United versus City issue. So if we had a larger team, then we'd probably look to have a dedicated women's reporter. But at the moment, with the resources that we have, we're sometimes quite limited. We see in the international breaks when there is a women's game, for example, United Women played at Old Trafford, and we sent reporters along, we live blogged it. There was a women's derby as well over an international break. We've seen absolutely huge audience numbers, but that's the problem. It's because when we're able to resource, we get the returns and there is the audience there. But when our Premier League teams are playing, we don't have the resources to necessarily go to every single game. But I think that's where, and it was mentioned before about like the next level of talent that's coming through. I think that's something that as football journalists and editors that we have to look to do more of. There are a lot of really bright young journalists coming through. There are a lot of universities in Manchester as well, which are producing the next generation of journalists. I know, for example, when I was studying, if I'd have been given the chance perhaps to do a work placement with a large publisher and to be able to be given a press pass to go along to cover a women's game, I'd have absolutely loved doing that. It would have been a great experience, and the media organisation would have got something out of it as well, as in really good coverage from someone who's enthusiastic, keen to learn and wants to do well. So I think that's something that I'm personally going to look to do before the next WSL season, is to see whether we can do any partnerships or link ups with student journalists in the region. So when we are on an occasion where the games are on the same day, we can make sure that we still have good coverage, which would be edited by the MEN editors when it comes in. And that gives perhaps a female student an opportunity to get a foot into the industry.
You talked really well before about the mentoring that you've done with younger female journalists and the sort of proactive steps you want to take. Claire, when you and I spoke, we talked a little bit the challenges of being a woman working in a male-dominated sport, rugby, and in an organisation that has been male-dominated. And so, do you want to just talk a little bit about the realities of that?
Well, I think the realities of that, I guess, as you would expect, so I joined Sale a year ago, and part of my remit was to support changing the culture. So we had a new director of rugby join, a new CEO join about 6 months before I joined. And that leadership team is there to change the culture from being that maybe more male-dominated, aggressive, as your stereotypical rugby environment, I suppose, into something that's a much more diverse, and not just diverse in terms of women being there, but diverse in terms of different types of experience, and pulling people in who maybe are students or graduates who haven't worked in rugby, or people who've worked for, like my background's brands, so pulling in people who aren't club people to try and change that culture and make it a more desirable environment to want to work in and to be in. And the rugby team, actually, it's the opposite way around. The rugby team are incredibly respectful and very polite, and there isn't that they have their camaraderie as a team. Of course they do, a team of guys playing sport, but they're not like that in front of me. And now we've got more girls in the business. So I think it's more just changing that perception and that culture that I think people who are coming out of university and looking for careers in sport, that it does feel like an accessible route, and that it isn't, lads. It's not like that. But I think, for Sale, that's the biggest thing we've achieved over the last year, is flipping that culture and making it run, I guess, more like a business and less like a club, and trying to really be that inclusive trailblazer and trying to stand tall next to the Uniteds and Cities. We are an elite performance club, and we probably need to be a bit more proud about that, and stand tall with that, and make sure that we have that culture that reflects that, and that we aren't, I guess, people aren't looking in and thinking that it's blokes just being kind of sexist and aggressive, that we change that perception. And I think yeah, it's early days, and internally, I think we've really done loads of work on that. I think our next job now is externally. How do we show that culture, and how do we show that growth mindset shift in our club, and our philosophy of being a better person? How do we tell that story and show kind of young women and young guys and graduates how they can come into that sporting environment, and that it isn't an intimidating place, and that it is an inclusive place to come in and learn. And I think Alice talked about mentoring, and we've just started to look at graduates and how do we bring graduates into that environment, because they don't have necessarily those same preconceptions. They are young, they're hungry, they're social media natives. We've got a girl starting in 2 weeks to come and run our women's social channels. We've had a guy doing it in the past, and we made a conscious decision that we wanted a girl because of the nuances of running a women's channel, even down to the types of words you might choose or the humour you might choose. It's very different. So, and that's a graduate coming in who's almost going to train on the job. So those are the kind of things that I guess our shift. We've never done that before, which might sound nuts to people who are listening to this, but we've never had that. It's always been, I've got a mate who plays rugby, or, oh, I know someone who knows someone, where now it's much more professional in that we want girls to come in and support our women's team and champion our women's team.
And before Sale, you worked in the sportswear industry. So you worked for Brooks, Asics, and I worked at Nike, and I saw a real sort of transformational shift in the way Nike approached it, which was much needed, because when I started, you had like football was a category, basketball was a category, running was a category, and women's was a category. And it's like, well, hang on, it's not a category, is it?
Right.
And so you saw that shift, and I think Nike went on a big journey. But we were talking about the fact that you saw that at the brands you worked at as well, and that's really important, that the brands, whether it's the sportswear brands or whether it's sponsors of clubs, federations, teams, are able to embrace the positive change and tell their own story.
Yeah, and I think Alice touched on it earlier, didn't she, from a media perspective, and PR's kind of sending a cookie cutter approach. I think, what I've seen over the years, running's more gender neutral, isn't it? Like anyone can go buy a pair of shoes and go running, and it's not so, it's not so different whether you're a guy or a girl. But I think that the shifts that I've seen, if I go right back to when I first started in sport, comments and inappropriate behaviour was kind of accepted. It was just, that's how it was in sport for a girl. And if you wanted to make it in sport, you just dealt with it. It's not like that now. But I think what I've seen change, certainly from Asics and more so when I went to Brooks, was creative toolkits would always have a male white runner as the lead creative. And over the years, I've seen that shift to more kind of inclusivity, groups of runners, women as the lead creative, which would have been unheard of even maybe 6 years ago. So starting to see the shifts in how creatives think about running from my experience, and not always defaulting, oh, well, it's a guy, a trim guy, white, 35-year-old, 30-year-old guy running. It's much more diverse in terms of race, in terms of gender, but in terms of look. And I think, maybe when I first joined Asics, we were very much we can only sell shoes if we use a white male in our creative. And I think that's definitely shifted from what I've seen. Maybe other people might disagree, but I think that's certainly what I've seen.
Vicky, in terms of the BBC, and going back to the BBC and the way that you approach communications there, take us through how you'll approach the Women's Euros. What's the sort of top line that you guys are looking at from a comms point of view around the tournament?
So first line is that you can watch the whole thing on the BBC, and so it's a navigational job of making sure that everyone knows where it is, when it's on, because it'll be across 1, 2, iPlayer, all that kind of. So first job is a navigational job. Next job is who our talent are, who our lineup are, all that kind of stuff. So the strategy, apologies if you can hear my dog going mental downstairs by the way. So the strategy starts with our launch, and it's just about awareness, getting it out to as many people as possible. And as I was saying earlier, it's not a one size fits all. So it's looking at what brands should you be tying up with, who do our talent line up, as we call them, who do our talent sort of align with, what outlets should we be talking to, what print media should we be doing, but who are the influencers, who are the brands. So our launch You know, normally you've just got your round tables. Now we've just got big spaces where you've got Joe, Sporth, Lad Bible, all of those kinds of people creating their own content. Because to Alice's point, nobody wants us to just churn out, here's some quotes with Alex Scott or Gabby Logan or whoever. They want to be doing that themselves, because what everyone wants is different. Actually, Alice, we should probably chat after this, because I was just getting some ideas about the Euros. Because what we've done with games before is, so we will let brands, we will give our talent a mobile phone, but they'll be there on behalf of a brand, and they will go and shoot content, and that talent can get to places that most people can't, because they'll get in dressing rooms, they'll get pitch side, they'll go and talk to players, they'll speak to groundsmen. They can create really good content packages, which will then go out on the platform for whoever we've sort of done that sort of tie up with. That's very different to how ordinarily we might have only done that on our own platforms. But again, I think someone said earlier, you're preaching to the converted in a sense. If you only keep going back to your own platforms, you're not going out to the people who've never watched the Euros, never watched women's sport, never engaged with it. We need to be finding those people who are new to it, might never have watched it, might have heard about it, might have thought it's not for them. They need to see it. They need to see what it's like. They need to see that it's actually really good quality, that we've got the same presenter lineup for that as we would have for a men's World Cup. So the strategy is, first and foremost, navigation, and then secondly, it's about awareness and just making sure, you know, we are the BBC. We're about bringing people together, making sure as many people as possible watch these big games. You know, and we saw for the Women's World Cup, the semi-final, England v USA, we did now, and this was something that we never would have done years ago because there wouldn't have been the appetite, but we searched the country. We wanted to do a fan event where we got press and fans together. So we searched the country to try and find a pub called the Lioness that we could do an event in. No such pub exists, believe it or not, in the whole country. So someone in my team had the very creative idea. They found an independent pub called the Lion, and this guy, for some reason, allowed us to rebrand his entire pub for 24 hours. So we got the painters in and we rebranded it. And obviously we got some great PR out of that because it's quite quirky. So we rebranded this pub the Lioness for 24 hours. We filled it. The atmosphere was incredible, but the viewing numbers for that, I'm going to say it was 12.8 million, which I think is right off the top of my head. We'd never, ever got numbers like that for women's football before. But what it showed is the appetite is there, fans want it, and it's like any major event. Men's football is the same. If England are doing well, or Wales, if you've got a home nations team doing well in a tournament, fans will follow it, and that was the same for the women's game. So it's the appetite is there. Our job is to make sure people know when and how they can watch it.
Okay, we've got a few questions coming in, a few comments coming in. So, question: what do you think are the most important media channels for women's sport? I mean, the BBC and Reach, a huge organisation.
All day.
BBC One, iPlayer, Alice is all over Reach. But in general, you've seen that what the Telegraph have done with their supplement. You've seen an explosion of outlets. Is there an opportunity for women's specific media to focus more on sport, or to your point, Vicky, is sport, and it's all about the mainstream media just covering it in a better and different way?
I think it's probably, so mainstream media buying in has been an absolute game changer. And like you say, what the Telegraph done and stuff like that has been amazing. Interestingly, it was probably about 8 years ago now, last time that when there was a sort of tournament, women's tournament, I went around and spoke to lots of women's outlets about what we could do around this tournament. And what was really interesting is their main focus was fitness, women's fitness. How do women keep fit? How do women get in shape? It wasn't about the sport. And I think that's what's changed. Now people are writing about the actual tournaments and the players and, you know, the game itself. It's not just about how do women get in shape, you know, like a footballer does kind of thing. So I think it again, it's chicken and egg. Everyone's got to buy in to sort of, it then becomes bigger than the sum of its parts. And the more people buy in, the more people become interested.
Alice, one question we've had come into us: would you be open to approaches from PRs who are doing sports partnerships with players, athletes, or is your content more from the clubs, the federations, and the sports themselves? Do you know, the commercial PRs coming in who have access to the athletes, is that something you're amenable to?
Yeah, absolutely. That sometimes works as well for us as it does through the clubs, because as you know more than anyone, at clubs have a lot of press officers attached to them, so sometimes there might be a lot of red tape to jump through before you get that 5 minutes with the player, whereas if it's a commercial thing, it might be a bit more freer. They might have a block of time with this person and then they can just invite us along, and it's sometimes a little bit more organic. So yeah, open to all approaches. Just drop me an email.
But you made a great point earlier on that what doesn't work for you is pre-canned content that you're just given and asked to run. I mean, you know, yes, Paul Pogba's content will always make, but for some of the female athletes, that's not going to work. You really need direct access. You know, you can give exchange for the commercial story so long as it's in keeping, but you need the access to the athletes and the voices, don't you?
Exactly that. And it's things as we're obviously a regional publisher but have a global audience, and we might want to talk about something different to what a national publication would want to talk to. And you know, we don't want to again ask the same questions that, you know, you might have seen in 5 articles prior to that. So, and I always think a conversation flows so much better if you've got 2 people just having a bit of a chat. You know, the athlete's more likely to be a bit more open, and the conversation's going to flow better. So yeah, absolutely, we'd much rather do it rather than a pre-packaged quotes thing, which, being frank with you, I don't remember the last time that we ran some quotes that had been given to us from, say, a PR agency from a women's athlete. We'd want to do that ourselves.
And have you seen examples, there's another question that's coming, have you seen examples of, for want of a better term, bandwagon jumping, you know, brands or PRs jumping gratuitously on the hot thing at the moment of the growth of women's sport and, you know, doing it badly, doing it wrong?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a few years ago, it was perhaps maybe betting firms that were guilty of doing that quite a lot without mentioning any names. But I do think we have moved on. I've not seen as many examples of that this time, I've got to be honest with you. I've seen examples of people not promoting it in the best way, as I've spoken about already, just doing it the same as you do for the men's game. But I've not seen any like horrible examples recently, but maybe I've not been looking in the right places. I don't know if anyone else has seen any.
No, we try to avoid them at Nike. We managed. One thing I would say, and this is from my personal experience for all the PRs, is your organization is only as good as its weakest link. So if your brand is making a big deal of talking about women's sport or women's athletes and talking this up, you're only as good as the issues. And we face an issue at Nike where we huge push on women's sport, huge push on female athletes, that was, you know, really very well done, quite successful in Nike brand marketing. We then found an issue with Alison Felix, the sprinter, whose maternity cover in her contract was simply unacceptable. And this caused a huge rift and a huge negative story. And it was a great example of how within a big company, sometimes the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand and you don't know what's going on. And then when I was at United, obviously we had a big push behind the women's team. And, you know, when the team went pro, and then a year and a half in during the pandemic, the women's team moved to Carrington, to the training ground, which wasn't really equipped for it. And it caused a big rift with our players because, quite rightly, our players are the professionals and they expected a certain level of facility, and they understood it might not be exactly the same level as the men, but it simply wasn't good enough. And so again, the push we had as a club to get behind the women's team, and the game at Old Trafford, which was a record attendance, was undermined by some of the coverage around the realities of the women's, you know, operation and the training facilities. So I think that's a key message for all brands involved, all clubs, is you're only as good as the walk you walk. And it's not enough to sort of do it at one end and not do it at the other.
Completely agree with that. Without mentioning any clubs' names, I've heard stories of, say, the men's team flying by you know, pretty much they've chartered their own plane to a Champions League game, and then the women's are having to get 2 indirect flights to reach the same destination if they're playing there. So I've heard a lot of that goes on behind the scenes. So you're completely right that you can do something to kind of for public appearance's sake, but if you're not behaving like that culturally within your organization, then it's going to get exposed eventually. And like you say, even the women that work for that organization won't be comfortable with the situation. It's got to be something that you commit to, from your CEO down to your most junior member of staff.
So we've just had Laura join us. Laura was our 4th panelist and wasn't able to make it beforehand. I think you're stuck in traffic, Laura.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. It's rail strikes, and then obviously I've been at Goodwood Festival speed, ironically, but not going very fast.
So you work as a comms for Women's Sports Trust. You're a big advocate of women's sport. And this is sort of separate to your day job, working with a motorsport organisation. Women's Sports Trust have clearly done a huge amount of furthering the cause of women's sport, a lot of research, which you sort of helped them launch last year. I wonder if you just want to talk about both the research itself and the process of PRing that.
Yeah, I think it's really important, because for anyone that's worked in women's sport for any time, the one thing that we were always told is that there's no audience for it. You know, I remember I was part of the team that launched the WSL, which is now over 10 years ago, which is how old I actually am. And you know, it was really shocking to me. Actually, this is what sort of got me back into my women's sport sort of passionate phase, was just the constant no from everybody. You know, no one's interested in it. We don't want to put it on the pages, no one will read it. You know, it was just constantly no. And I think that led to brands and everybody else thinking there was no viable audience, and therefore the investment didn't come out either. And so from a women's sports trust point of view, what we want to do, our kind of purpose, is to make women's sport more visible, viable and unstoppable. So the visibility piece was the first piece, is like, how can we actually prove that there is an audience there? And what was annoying is, like, you found people kind of talking about research. There was one piece of research that was done in about 2007 that people kept referring to, and that was the only research on visibility in women's sport. So it made it really difficult for anyone who was selling women's sport to have anything tangible to talk about. So in the last year, we've kind of gone on a case of having about 3 now big research pieces to just prove that audience is there, and actually that it's growing. And this last one that we launched last week, which is definitely worth going to have a look at on our website, just proved that Q1 was the most watched quarter of women's sport ever. And when you look particularly at the WSL, you know, as somebody who's been championing that for a long time, it was phenomenal to see the rise, you know, obviously because of the Sky and the BBC deals that came through, and the support that both of those channels have given it, meant that was really fantastic. And we were seeing a sort of a rise, a 4-time rise in viewership of the season last season compared to the season before. So, you know, it's finally there that we've got the figures and the data that we can sort of stop people saying, you know, there's no audience. I think for me that then the next barrier is then, how do we make that viable? So, you know, taking those figures and being able to then go to brands and say that there clearly is an audience here. So, you know, what can we build together, and how can we get more investment in? Because that's the thing that's the most frustrating now, is that we have to make women's sports sustainable, and we have to be able to pay people a living wage, and we can't do that until that investment comes in. And there's a slight, sometimes, you know, we do a campaign called Unlocked, which is all about supporting elite female athletes. And so we get a lot of first-hand response from the athletes who sort of say it's really difficult because the visibility is going up now. So then there's a sort of presumption that, oh, they're professional sportswomen, they've, you know, earn a load of money, and that they're fine. They were in a Sky ad, or they were, you know, I saw them, you know, working for Pepsi or whatever. But still, obviously, that is not the case of the majority of sportswomen, and that they are still having second jobs or living at home into their 30s because they can't support themselves. So, you know, we really need to use that visibility now and move it into sort of sustainable value.
And when, you know, research is one of the great tools of the PR industry. You know, a good research always makes a good story. When you were pushing that research out, did you find it was an easy sell, and media were receptive to that story in itself?
Yeah, totally. You know, slight PR error, because I wasn't really involved in this. We decided to do half the story about 6 weeks ago, and then the other half last week. Didn't really work that. I'm not quite sure why that happened. But the first bit that went out to get a lot of media, but I do find, you know, I find media now really receptive to the stories, and you know, we've worked so closely with, you know, particularly BBC, Sky, Telegraph, you know, because they are also really trying to understand women's sport more and how they can support it more. So, you know, it is pushing an open door a lot of the time now when we go to them with new statistics, and we can give them actual data and insight, which has been really missing in women's sport before.
Okay, I think we've sort of covered a lot of the topics today. Are there any other questions? I had a few coming in the messages. Any other questions for any of the audience that they want to ask live at all? Emma, you're on mute.
Laura, it's Emma.
Hello, Emma. How are you? You all right?
Did we catch you up at Duncan's wedding?
Yes.
No, it's sorry, it's very boring for everyone else, but I've gone freelance now, and I was talking about going for a coffee and all that. 'Cause I was talking about it a couple of years ago, but yeah, now I've done it.
Well done. Congrats. Made the leap.
Emma, you came with a few questions on the text. Are there any of the questions you wanted to ask live to any of the panel?
I think pretty much, I'm just looking down the text. I think pretty much they've all been answered. Because I was obviously coming at it from very PR sort of point away of working with players, but then from media point of view, does it feel like we're jumping on the bandwagon? So no, I feel like it's been great.
Okay.
Everything, I think.
Well, I think people obviously got a lot going on at the moment, and people need to probably go and cool down in a room somewhere. So I want to say thanks to all the panelists for being part of this. It's been a pleasure to chair this little session, and I really genuinely hope we all get a chance to do this in person. I think in person will be a lot better, and this is just a reminder of the bad old days of everything being on Teams and Zoom to some extent, but it can't be helped with the rail strikes. And I was acutely aware of being asked to chair this as a bloke being asked to chair this, so apologies for any mansplaining or patronising tone that I inadvertently gave across. I'm going to hand back to Lisa now.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. No, you were fantastic. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. What a great discussion. I wish we could have done it face to face, but hopefully at some point when we've got no strikes and other things going on, we can all get together. And maybe it's something we can explore later on in the summer when we can safely do joint events again. But yeah, it was fantastic, really good discussion. I really look forward to seeing all the coverage around the Women's Euros. I went to an event a few weeks ago, actually, with my eldest, a sport event with the BBC, Vicky, that was in Manchester, and she plays a lot of football. And it was great, actually. It was really good to get involved in like different activities and have a go at being a BBC presenter and other things like that. But yeah, but thank you everybody for your time. And Charlie, again, thank you for hosting it. And Laura, hello. I know you joined us a little bit late on, but it was really good to have you with us. And as I said, we'll get this edited and shared, and obviously I'll get a bit wider reach on our social media channels, and hopefully see you all face to face soon. So thank you for your time.
I know the women's Euro first game at Old Trafford is basically a sellout now, so hopefully we'll all be tuning into that to watch England as well.
Yeah,
You want that one, Charlie?
So on the BBC apparently, so I'm told.
Any more plugs there?
All right. Thanks everybody. Cheers. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye. Bye.